Hello, I'm David Swift. I'm the author of A Left for Itself, published by Zero Books last year. And in this piece I'm going to be responding to a few different articles about the recent failure of the Bernie Sanders primary in the US, and also last year's disappointing result for the Labour Party in the UK general elections. In particular, the pieces I'm going to be responding to a couple on Jacobin, one by Anton Jager, entitled "We Bet the House on Left Populism and Lost," and also David Sirota's "The Tyranny of Decorum Hurt Bernie Sanders." In addition to these two pieces, I'm also going to make reference to a piece by, an interview with Sean McElwee. And McElwee was, or is the founder of the polling and policy group Data for Progress, and he was also the guy who coined and popularised the expression "abolish ICE" last year. And finally, I'm also going to be drawing on a much older essay from 1939, written by Sam Moss, entitled "The Importance of the Revolutionary Group." And yeah, just one final thing I want to say is that actually I started preparing the script for this piece over a week ago, before the recent events after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the subsequent protests in so many US cities. And I mention this because actually one of the sort of themes of what I'm about to say is that I'm really quite pessimistic about the possibility of non-sort of democratic forces for change, and about the actual possibilities of street protests and stuff. And given what we're seeing in the US, and the sort of anger out there on the streets, the number of people taking to the streets, and the real sentiment that things must change this time, not just in terms of racist policing, but in a much broader sense. You may have seen the recent monologue by Cornel West on CNN, when Cornel West was given a great deal of time to make a sort of impassioned plea that this should result in a sort of real redistribution of democratic rights and wealth and respect for all Americans. So it feels a bit weird, maybe, in the context of that, to actually talk about how I'm quite pessimistic about the possibility of this happening, other than by the ballot box. But I'll explain my reasoning later on. The first sort of theme I want to address then is, I think that all too often those of us on the left in Britain and the US can be a bit over-optimistic about the policy, the potential for change and the demand for change among the people in our respective countries. So, for example, Anton Jager starts his piece talking about the achievements of Sirota in Greece, and both in electing the Sirota party and then also voting no in the referendum on whether to accept the sort of humiliating and punitive EU bailout conditions. And I remember, full well the enthusiasm generated at the time on the left by the Sirota victory, but even at the time I remember thinking that this was a bit premature and over-optimistic, in the sense that they didn't actually achieve anything yet, right? They'd elected a left-wing populist government, great. They had said no in the referendum to the EU, but by itself, this didn't mean anything, and we saw what came later, right? And I think this is quite an instructive tale as to how we can't be too excited by these very small steps. And I actually think that the fact that we do get so excited about such things, right, like the Sirota victory in Greece, the no in the referendum, Bernie Sanders coming very close to beating Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, and again looking like he was going to be the nominee this year, at least after the first few states, Labour losing and coming second in the UK in 2017. All too often these events are maybe not so much mythologized, but certainly they're looked upon as being harbingers of greater fortunes, when they're not necessarily at all, unfortunately. So it shows you how lean the pickings have been for the left in recent years, that we get so excited about such quite small steps. Another thing is that this is the situation in Greece came about in a really extreme circumstance, and we have to wonder, do we think that it is actually necessary to have such an extreme condition as was happening in Greece a few years ago to lead to progress for the left? Because I firstly don't think that that's necessary, and I also think that actually this sort of deterioration of the economy and people's living standards, etc., that we see happening now, can sometimes lead to opportunities for the right, and very often it might be the right that actually takes this and succeeds with it. I mean, certainly in terms of democracy, right, in terms of democratic processes, we've seen Trump in the USA, we've seen Brexit and the Conservatives in the UK, we've seen the likes of President Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Netanyahu in Israel, etc., Bolsonaro in Brazil. So the sort of the global squeeze on living standards and what might appear to some people to be the death throes of neoliberalism have actually benefited the right so far rather than the left. So Jager in his piece quotes one Spanish activist from 2012 who said that the crisis is not enough. And I think this sums it up, right? It's simply because capitalism appears to be in crisis, simply because, indisputably, we've had the largest squeeze on middle and working class living standards in many years, simply because there is such a vast discrepancy now between the very richest people and the rest of the people. All of these things are unmistakably true, but by no means does that mean that it will benefit the left. You have to work hard to mobilize and to organize people. And again, I think in order to do this and to do it effectively, we need to really be realistic about the limits of the appeal of a radical platform right now. So, for example, Jager notes that when Alexis Tsipras was elected in 2015, the leader of Sirota, he counted no less than 30% of Greek youth among his supporters. And Jager sort of trumpets this figure and says, how great is it that 30% of young people supported a radical socialist party? Well, what about the other 70%, right? All too often when we are over-optimistic about the appeal of a socialist platform, we tend to often essentialize and radicalize without their consent entire groups of people, right? So young people, the working class, whatever that means, people of colour, are all assumed to be inherently radical and to really desire, a complete overhaul of our politics and our society and our economy. And unfortunately, that's just not necessarily the case. So I think we are sometimes over-optimistic about the radicalism of the population and also about the left's ability to build an election-winning coalition. So Jager addresses this in his piece around the failure of Corbyn's Labour Party. So Jager says, quote, that the cultural outlook did not always mesh with the older working class base targeted by left populists. This became visible in Corbyn's Labour Party, where a precarious coalition of blue-collar northern workers and cosmopolitan southern millennials started to dissolve over the Brexit vote. Right? So he's highlighting here, and I completely agree with him about that, by the way, this fissure that was always present within Corbynism between people more like me and probably more like you, younger, better educated, more left-wing people who want to see all sorts of change and are pretty left across the board, right? So not just in economics, but in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of LGBT, in terms of climate change, and so on. And at the same time, you have these more traditional Labour voters who may well be left in terms of economics, but actually often quite have small C conservative views on all of those extra issues I've just mentioned. And one of the problems with this in the UK was that plenty of people denied that there was ever such a contradiction, right? The academic Joe Kennedy published a book last year or 2 years ago entitled Authentocrats, where he didn't just rightly mock the ridiculous ways that ridiculous lengths some politicians would go to suggest that they were men of the people, but actually explicitly denied that there was any such clash of values. He argued that not only are many of these traditional Labour voters very left-wing on all of these issues. But actually that was indicative of class hatred to say otherwise. And I think this was a completely and obviously false argument. I'm going to talk more about this later. But it was one that many people were making. Even before the election happened, plenty of people would say, we shouldn't patronise, the traditional working class. The traditional working class are just as left on race issues and, say, climate change and imperialism as, people with postgraduate degrees are. And I really hope if there's one thing that we can take from the catastrophe of last year's general election in the UK, it's to bury this idea, and we can stop feeling obliged to deny that there is such a conflict. But another thing I want to talk about Jager's quote there is, I really doubt that there was any such coalition in the first place, right? So Jager talks about how this uneasy coalition between the traditional white working class Labour voters and the new sort of more cosmopolitan, better educated Corbyn supporters dissolved over Brexit. Well, I often wonder sometimes what were the issues that united them in the first place, because one of the biggest draws to Corbyn's Labour for many young people was their policy to abolish university fees. Well, this is something that had fairly limited traction amongst these more traditional Labour voters. Also, the Corbyn Labour Party did not commit to reversing conservative cuts to welfare and benefits over the past 10 years. And whilst there were some key issues which might have brought people together, such as railway nationalisation and nationalisation of key energy companies and utilities and so on, generally, there was actually not that much to unite all of these disparate people together. Especially because there actually may be less demand for economic radicalism among traditional Labour voters than there are among, say, the new Corbyn supporters. And also actually not just in terms of class, but in terms of ethnicity as well. Frankly, it may well be the case that black and Asian and ethnic minority Britons are actually less radical in terms of socio-economics than the sort of better educated white people who formed the vanguard of Corbynism. Talking about the USA now, in David Sirota's article, he claims that despite Bernie Sanders' principles, he's never been, quote, a scorched earth politician. So for Sirota, Bernie's approach is defined by a belief that to make real change from the outside, you must push hard, but always maintain one foot inside the power structure and not try to burn it all the way down. The calculation is that if you are too adversarial against the establishment, you will be instantly marginalised, depicted as irrelevant and disempowered. Right, so that's Sirota trying to sum up Bernie's feelings about the importance of not being seen as sort of an outsider figure to too great an extent, about how you need to work within existing political structures, existing power structures, in order to achieve change. This is something that Sean McElwee picks up on in his interview. So he claims that one of the biggest misunderstandings of the left is the idea that the Democratic brand is bad. In fact, the Democratic Party brand is one of the strongest brands in the country. It's something millions of Americans trust. That includes the African American and Latino voters who are sympathetic to progressive ideas and are voters we need to persuade to support our candidates. Right? So the point that McElwee is making here, I think, is very important, both in the US and in the UK, in that there are so many people who really need systemic change right now. Poor black and brown people in the USA, poor black and brown people in the UK, poor people in both countries, who are actually very attracted to the brands and the institutions of the Democratic Party and the Labour Party. And I think a lot of people on the left in both countries are so sceptical about both of these institutions and these brands, and they're very sceptical about the potential of these institutions and brands to actually affect real change. But I think that for good or ill, these brands, these institutions, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, actually have a great deal of trust and support among precisely the sort of people that need real change and precisely the sort of people that we're trying to reach out to. talking about African Americans and Latinos in the US, McElwee continues to say that in 2020, the early states were disproportionately caucus states and disproportionately white, which papered over some worrying political weaknesses for progressives. If Iowa and Nevada had been primaries, we would have seen those weaknesses earlier. Right? So this is really important point to take on board, actually, that one of the reasons Bernie had such early success is not only because of the sort of caucus nature of Iowa and so on and Nevada, which sort of limits the number of people who are involved in the process, but also the fact that, you know, Iowa and New Hampshire are so white. And sure, okay, Bernie did well with Hispanics in Nevada, but then as we got to South Carolina, as we got to the Super Tuesday states, notwithstanding the fact that the other Democratic contenders pulled out and threw their weight behind Joe Biden, etc., Bernie does seem to did then, and again in 2016, did seem to underperform with different ethnic minorities, particularly with African Americans. And, you know, this is something that, rather than just try to avoid the issue and pretend it's not a case, those of us on the left really need to think about. You know, we need to think, why is it the case that very often African Americans and different people of colour in the UK, in the US, around the world, are often less supportive of left-wing projects than we might think that they might be or should be. And actually, Sirota's article, despite talking about Bernie's failures, doesn't mention African Americans once. Right? It literally just doesn't consider that, you know, this might be an issue either for Bernie specifically or for the left more broadly. And really, I think that this is, this is something that's so important. And unfortunately, I think the left often just doesn't want to consider it. You know, it's almost like it in the same way that the idea that, you know, the working class, especially in the UK, that the working class may not actually be that radical, is something that many UK leftists simply do not want to consider, and will go to any lengths of sophistry to pretend that's not the case. And likewise, I imagine many American leftists simply do not want to believe that African Americans aren't this great potential for radical politics, and that actually might be a bit more conservative than, you know, young, well-educated white kids. This maybe looks a bit different now, given what we're seeing in the US after the murder of George Floyd. But again, you know, who knows? I just read a really interesting article by this guy, Astrid Herndon, on the New York Times, who was talking about the situation in Columbia, South Carolina, and, you know, how angry lots of African Americans are down there. But he was also saying, you know, this is exactly the sort of place where a lot of these African Americans voted for Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders. So translating this anger at police brutality and institutional racism and so many other of the sort of structural and systemic disadvantages facing African Americans in the USA, translating that into votes for socialist primary contenders and then for, you know, a socialist Democratic Party nominee is going to be quite tough. And a final thing is about young people, right? So this belief that young people are particularly left-wing, I think, is quite erroneous in many ways. You know, I've worked at universities and I've met lots of young people, and sure, great, whilst fortunately many left-wing positions on race, gender identity, climate change especially, are almost considered, you know, almost assumed to be self-evident amongst lots of young people. So there's been lots of progress made there. By no means are these people particularly economically left-wing, and certainly by no means are they necessarily wanting to get involved in politics or thinking politics can actually change anything, right? So obviously we've seen, especially in the UK, I think young people being squeezed out of being able to afford to own housing. Certainly in both countries around the developed world, actually, even before the coronavirus crisis, we've seen a real sort of opening up the disparity in wealth and income and opportunities between older generations and younger people. Sure, but that by no means translates into radical politics among the young. You know, if you go to a university campus and you see what's going on there, a lot of people don't give a shit about politics, frankly. They care about what students care about, you know, getting drunk, having sex, taking drugs, etc. And as so often, the ones who are into politics are sort of a bit maligned and seen as a bit weird, frankly. And likewise, actually, if you think not just about young people on university campus, etc., but young people more broadly, right? If you go onto Twitter, go onto Twitter and you see what's trending on Twitter, and sometimes maybe a politics thing does come up. But actually, if you look outside left Twitter and you see what the trends are on Twitter amongst young people not into politics, very often the key political issue of the day just doesn't even register. Like, they don't give a shit. To conclude my point about how we've been maybe a bit over-optimistic about the radical potential of the electorate, I want to talk about just how shallow the roots of Corbynism seem to be in the UK. So a few months ago, in the autumn of last year, the fall of last year, before the election, many people were saying, whatever happens with Jeremy himself, whatever happens in the next election, Corbynism is here to stay. I remember reading an interview with John Landsman, who is the founder of Momentum. Momentum, in case for those of you who don't know, is a Corbyn pressure group set up within the Labour Party to lobby for the success of Corbyn and the success of his brand of socialism within the Labour Party. And John Landsman was saying in this interview with the New Statesman magazine last year, whatever happens now, whatever happens with Corbyn, whatever happens with the Corbyn Labour Party, Corbynism is here to stay. And actually, within a few months of that defeat last December, we've seen everything sort of fade away, right? The Corbyn continuity candidate, Rebecca Long-Bailey, did very badly in the leadership election. Now, fairly easily, we've had a fairly centrist General Secretary appointed to be the General Secretary of the Labour Party. Momentum itself is cannibalizing, right? There are now various Momentum splinter groups set up, like Forward Momentum and Momentum-NL and all the rest of it. All of the sort of People's Front of Judean People's Front sort of stereotypes that we associate with the far left is happening, right? For me, this was pretty obvious. I went to Venezuela back in 2008, and it was really obvious that as soon as Chavez died, the whole thing would fall apart, right? It was so much built around his personality and how charismatic he was, and so much of it was around that one guy. And it would have been, I felt, an impossible job for whoever took over to maintain that level of sort of commitment and enthusiasm and so on and all the rest of it, and so it proved. And this was clearly what was going to happen with Corbyn. I remember after a wedding last year in Manchester, and one of my old mates from Liverpool, and then we went back to Liverpool the next day. We were drinking the whole time and stuff, and I got into conversation with this girl, and she was, in between rants about Israel and all the rest of it, she was saying how the Guardian newspaper is really anti-Corbyn. And I was thinking, if you think the Guardian newspaper is anti-Corbyn, which is one of probably the two newspapers in the UK that will be willing to give him a fair hearing, then you've got a bit of a problem there. But also the fact that, she didn't say anti-Labour or anything like that, right? She said anti-Corbyn. And I was thinking, this girl knows nothing about that. And sure enough, she couldn't name any other Labour politicians, for example. So this girl, was a massive Corbyn fan, but not really a fan of Labour, and not even necessarily a fan of socialism. And I think that for me was quite worrying, actually. And it suggested to me that if Corbyn the man went, then Corbynism, the phenomenon, would go.